Hello guys, we are going to be talking today about congruent triangles. Now if we have two triangles that are congruent or more, what this means is they have all the same sides and the same angles, right? Because we talked about congruent lengths, we've talked about congruent angles. We can call two triangles congruent if they really are the exact same triangle. So looking at these pictures, obviously these pictures look a little bit different because one triangle is pointing up and one triangle is pointing down, but it really is the same triangle, and here's how we can see why. Notice again, we've talked about these little markings. Remember, these are my markings for congruent sides. These are my markings for angles. So if we notice, I'm going to use some color here. This side over here is side DA. That is congruent to, now remember again, we kind of skimmed over this. That little symbol right there, an equal sign with a little squiggle over it, means congruent. And I know it's kind of confusing, but it really does mean the exact same thing as equal. We just use congruent if we don't know the actual number. Like we don't know if DA is 5 inches or 10 inches, or if we don't know that, yeah. So if we don't know the actual number, we use that symbol. If we do know the number, then we can say equal. So DA is congruent to, let's look over at the other triangle. Well, DA is going to be congruent to the side over here that also only has one marking. That's how we can tell what's congruent. So what side over here is DA congruent to? OG, the OG side, or GO. We could call this AD, we could call it GO, it'll be the same thing. Let's go through and find the other congruent sides. We have the next side over here is DY or YD. We can flip those. Tell me on the other triangle over here, what is DY congruent to? FG, because this has 2 markings, it's congruent to this side over here that also has 2 markings. Again, you could say GF. So hopefully it's obvious that AY, which has 3 markings, is congruent over here to FO, which also has 3 markings. So this tells us those sides are going to be the exact same length. So we have the same thing with the angles as well. This angle A is congruent to the angle in this triangle that also only has one little rainbow. Which angle over here only has one little rainbow? Angle O. And then we can keep going from here. This has 2 little rainbows, that's angle D. What is that congruent to over here in this triangle? Angle G also has 2 little rainbows. And then we can see pretty clearly once more that this has 3 rainbows, this has 3 rainbows. So angle Y is congruent to angle F. So because this is true, we can write what's called a congruence statement. Because these 2 triangles have all 3 sides congruent, have all 3 angles congruent, we just have to be very careful and be very specific how we write the congruence statement. The congruent angles need to go in order. So we have options, yeah. I can put, for my first triangle, I can put it in any order I want to. It doesn't matter, you can choose. Now how we're going to write this, I'm going to go ahead and write the congruent statement up here so we can see it next to our triangles. I'm going to say triangle, the one on the left, is congruent to triangle, the one on the right, but here's how we have to name them. So when we name triangles, our little symbol is a little baby triangle, just like how we have an angle out here in front. We put a little triangle out in front, and then for my first triangle, I'm going to choose the order to write the letters. It doesn't matter, I can write them in any orders. So I'm going to go ahead and go D-A-Y. We'll call this triangle day. Now, it doesn't matter what I choose for the first triangle, but for the second triangle, if I choose to write it D, then A, then Y, I have to put the letters over here in the same order, meaning what angle is congruent to D has to go first, What angle is congruent to y A has to go second. And then what angle is congruent to y has to go last. So let's look. I chose D first. That was 2 markings. So I have to put G first. We have to be able to look at a congruent statement, and you'll see why later. The congruent statement tells us which angles are congruent to which, and also which sides as well. It helps us with that too. So I put A next. A is next, and that has 1 rainbow. So the next letter I have to put over here also has 1 rainbow, G-O. And then obviously, if I put Y last, that's 3 markings, I'm putting F. So this is one example of a congruent statement. Triangle DAY is congruent to triangle GOF. I'm going to have you try it one more time. So I'm going to change the name for triangle DAY. I'm going to erase all of this to make it a little bit easier to see. So let's call triangle DAY something different because we can. We have that choice. Let's call it triangle instead, ADY. Now that we have moved the letters around, our second triangle name has to change as well. Whatever is congruent to A goes first, whatever is congruent to D goes second, whatever is congruent to Y goes third. So go ahead and take a second, write out the order for these letters over here. Okay, so let's see, what is congruent to A? That's O, so O has to go first. What's congruent to D is G. I'm running out of space here. And then what's congruent to Y is F. Again, it does not matter what you choose to name your first triangle, but then your second triangle has to match. The first letters have to be congruent, the second letters have to be congruent, the third letters have to be congruent. So hopefully that makes sense. We could name this a couple other different ways. We have lots of options. These are just 2 examples. Okay. Now here's why this is important that we are labeling our triangles in the correct way with our congruent statement. If we are given 2 triangles that are congruent, if they tell us like this, these 2 triangles are congruent, we can use one triangle to help us solve for missing parts in another triangle because we know they're the same. So if I have a part in one triangle, I know that part also exists in the other. So here's what we have to pay attention to. I am looking for Fn given this is true. So I want to find this side. Now, we can probably tell based off the picture, but that is a terrible idea. Never base your answers off the picture. You need to base it off the congruence statement. Super duper important. So if you notice here, we want to find Fn, this side lick. Notice that F is here and N is here in triangle fun, because geometry is fun. What I need to look at in my other triangle then to determine what Fn is those same letters in the same position. So G and O are in the same positions as F and N. So what that means is I need to look at side GO. So because these 2 sides are congruent, GO is congruent to Fn. What's Fn? 27. Duh, I hope. Or by now, duh, if you weren't sure before. So again, to determine which sides are congruent, it's based on the congruent statement. Because they wanted us to find Fn, here was F, here was N, we need to look at side GO. GO is the same as Fn. It is not based on the picture, it is based on the congruent statement. I can't say enough how important that is. Let's try it a little harder now with angles. So once more, we are looking at the congruent statement to determine what we need. We are not looking at the picture. Especially in this case, we're not looking at the picture because this one's going to be a little bit trickier. So here's what we do. We determine where our angle is that we're trying to find. In the other triangle, we are going to look at that corresponding angle. So measure of angle E, notice E is the second letter here. What that means is I need to look at U. E and U are in the same are in the same position in the middle of the congruent statement. So that means that angle E is congruent to angle U. If they are in the same position, they are congruent. So let's look for at angle where we want angle E. We don't have it. And here's angle U. There we go. So what is the measure of angle E? 83 degrees. Once again, our congruent statement said that these two angles are congruent. Therefore, they have the exact same measure. Super easy so far, I hope. Now we're going to take it up a step. Equations. This always happens in geometry. We always start off with the vocabulary. We move into just basic numbers, and then eventually we have to add in variables. Okay, so here's the thing, guys. We have no pictures. We need to draw pictures. It is super important that if a question in geometry does not give you a picture, you need to draw it yourself. Geometry is all about the visual. So I'm going to go ahead and draw this. They don't need to be any special way. Here's one triangle, here's another. However, I do have to label them in the same order. G, E, O, it doesn't matter where I put G and E and O. I'm going to go ahead and choose to put G here, E here, and O here. Take a second then, because now it matters. If I went G to E to O, I have to, in order to do this correctly, go in the same order for my second triangle. Take a second and label triangle fun the same way we did triangle GO. Okay, so if I went G to E to O, I need to go F to U to N. You have to, otherwise you will get the question wrong. And this makes it easy because now we can see they're lined up. G and F are congruent, E and U are congruent, O and N are congruent. So now we're going to continue to label our picture. So GE is 3x minus 4. So I'm going to just write that right along here. Here's GE, 3x minus 4. I have that EO is 15. So let's find EO. I have the measure of angle O is 24. Here's O. I'm going to put this right here. What I want you guys to do real quick is we're going to pause the video and you are going to label the other three. So go ahead and try to label the other three measures on the other triangle. Okay, let's check. We have that FU is 11. Yeah, that's not the greatest name for a side length, whatever. FU is 11. Angle F is 68. And the measure of angle N is 4y plus 8. So hopefully you labeled your pictures correctly. If you guys are not able to label your pictures correctly, you won't get the answer right. Okay, so we need to find X and Y. So here's X over here, and here's Y over here. Hey, we found them. Yeah, no. We actually gotta solve for them, right? So here's what I need to know. If I have congruent sides, they are equal, set them equal to each other. Guys, whenever we say that, if we say two things are equal, literally rewrite them, the two things that are equal, pop an equal sign between them, and then solve. Luckily, we have this all lined up and good to go. So notice X is over here. What number is 3x minus 4 going to be set equal to from the other triangle? 11. We have said these two triangles are congruent, so those two sides are equal. So copy them, set them equal to each other. Take a moment, go ahead and solve that equation. Okay, so we determined these two sides are congruent, so we are allowed to set them equal to each other. This is how we're going to go about solving for X. You should have gotten that X equals 5. But we still need to solve for Y. So let's find where Y is at. Y is now over here. So what am I going to set this equation to? What angle in the other triangle is 4y plus 8 going to be set equal to? 24, they're in the same position. They're congruent because I drew my triangles that way. I drew them specifically so that it goes in order. I don't have to like, wait, okay, what angle is this one congruent to? These triangles are flipped. No, they're in order. So we have 4y. If these angles are congruent, set them equal to each other. Go ahead and take a moment to solve. Okay, let's check. So I need to subtract the 8 and divide the 4. 4y equals, what is that? 16. That should be right. Divide by 4. We got y equals 4. And there's our answer. We look back up to the question. That's all they wanted us to do. You always go back and reread the question because we're good geometry students, and we make sure we actually found what they were asking. Since they didn't ask us to find a missing angle or a missing side or something like that, we don't have to go back and plug it. So this is the basics. Hopefully it makes sense. That again, congruent means these two things are the exact same. And when we have shapes and sides and angles that are the exact same, we can set them equal to each other. So this is the basics. We're going to go on and continue from here in class.